Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Teacher's Workshop. And this week, we're going to be dealing with the text of Numbers chapter 21, which, if you're familiar with that story, that, of course, brings us to the end of Moses' time with the people of Israel and their tenure of wandering out in the wilderness, when that generation who had been consigned to the wilderness for 40 years is about to completely die off, and then their children will be entering the land after them. So for those of us who are familiar with the story, we may also be familiar, and I think should be familiar with the fact that this story comes up quite poignantly in the New Testament when Jesus in John chapter 3 is sitting with Nicodemus under cover of dark and having a conversation about all the things that are pressing upon Nicodemus's mind and heart. And then when Nicodemus is rather floored to hear Jesus speak about being born again, Jesus uses this as a very clear, but abstract also, example of what has to happen with respect to entering into the kingdom, what the purpose of his entire mission is. And so with that, he gives the example of Moses holding up the snake in the wilderness. And then, of course, the people looking to it and finding life, and then Jesus himself must be lifted up, and then he will draw all men unto him. And in doing so, if they believe, they will not perish. So, the first thing I would try to help you with is let's understand that before we just jump from this story in Numbers 21 with Moses and Israel directly to Jesus, we're going to be passing over some very key things. In fact, I would say that it's very likely that most Israelites would have not made a connection between what happened with Moses and the Israelites in Numbers 21 and the Messiah. There was no messianic anticipation whatsoever that he was going to fulfill such a thing. And before we start drawing immediate parallels between, say, Moses probably taking two pieces of wood and creating a cross out of it, and then taking that bronze snake-shaped object and wrapping it around it, and then holding it up in front of the people, that this would have been something that everyone should have clearly understood was going on whenever Jesus was being splayed out between heaven and earth and crucified. In fact, we have nobody else even hearing of this except for Nicodemus and maybe a few disciples who were close to Jesus. And we have no idea if they even shared that. Nobody else seems to be talking about this until John writes it down some years after Jesus has departed from their presence. So my only cautionary note is let's not be so hasty to jump immediately to that in the first few minutes of our lesson, but rather let's spend some time in the text here in Numbers 21 to try to develop the meta narrative. And then, of course, I think it's a very appropriate place for us to create what's so obvious of a connection for us that Jesus gives in the New Testament. I think it would probably be a bit wrong for us maybe to not hit that if we have the time to. So that being said, I have a rather simple construct here, but what I want to try to do is capitalize on something that perhaps by the time we got to Numbers 21 in our normal Bible, we may have forgotten happened a few books back all the way at the beginning of Moses' story with Israel in the book of Exodus. And I hope that we can appreciate the kind of bookend effect that goes on with these particular stories. So let's dive in the upper left corner in that first black block. But in doing that, I want to draw attention to this title here. As the snake appears, the Exodus both begins and ends. So that doesn't mean in the book of Exodus, where this particular thing starts, again in the upper left corner, that we're seeing both the beginning and ending of the Exodus, but rather its beginning. And then by the time we get to this story of Numbers 21, we're only a breath away from Deuteronomy, and the events of that book probably span just maybe a month or so before Moses dies, and then Joshua officially takes over and begins the conquest. So, in other words, the appearance of the snake is seemingly signaling both the beginning and the end of the Exodus period as we go from Exodus 3 and 4 all the way up to Numbers 21. So, without further ado, at the left corner, Israel is in Egypt, and Moses wants a sign to show the people, because in Exodus chapter 4, the Lord has already appeared to him in the burning bush. In this conversation at the beginning of chapter 3 is continuing now in chapter 4. And Moses answered, what if they don't believe and will not obey me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you? The Lord asked him, what is in your hand? A staff, he replied. Throw it on the ground. So Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. So from this, I think one thing we can deduce is that the people will perhaps want a sign to know for sure that Moses isn't a charlatan and that they're not getting their hopes up or something. But in the end, will, of course, not materialize. And they, of course, will be gravely punished. Probably many of them will wind up dying if they try to rebel against Pharaoh under the auspice that the Lord has indeed sent them in to deliver them. So if they want proof, the Lord is definitely accommodating here to Moses. He doesn't chastise him for this. In fact, he saddles him with three different signs. But the first one is that of this staff becoming a snake. So the idea is that the people will see the sign and that they will believe Yahweh will save them. And this is exactly what winds up happening, because as we finish this concourse and we find Moses actually arriving back in Egypt, it says that he assembled the elders, he spoke with them, and he showed them the signs that the Lord had given them. So they clearly saw Moses' staff turning into a snake. Maybe it was Aaron's staff. They did, since Aaron and Moses are now a joint team. But nonetheless, the point is that they see the sign and that they believe that God will save them. So this is the beginning of the Exodus journey. So now we move down to the bottom left of the screen. Israel coming out of Egypt. And we see the snake, not yet. Got to jump ahead of myself. We see instead something else, a battle happen. So Israel needs water, and then they get attacked. Now, this is important because this is actually what sets us up for the scene of what happens in Numbers 21. So let's just pay attention for a second. Now, this is what the Lord says. I'm going to stand here in front of you at the rock of Horeb. When you hit the rock, water will come out of it and people will drink. This is in Exodus chapter 17 and verse 6. 2 verses later, while at Rephidim, Amalek came and they fought against Israel. So immediately a battle begins to ensue. So let's try to piece this together here. So probably a few months earlier, Moses is entered into Egypt, to face Israel first in telling them that the Lord has appeared to him in the wilderness and he has sent him to deliver them. They converse with Moses. We really have no idea if anybody dissented the way Moses thought that they would, but nonetheless, he shows them the signs and they back him. They recognize that God has indeed sent him because of these supernatural signs. So they see and they believe. 7 months later, after all 10 plagues have been executed upon Egypt, and now they have crossed through the Red Sea. And they are on their way to Mount Sinai. They run out of water. They're thirsty. They cry out to Moses. They grumble a bit, yes. But after the Lord does this supernatural miracle of cracking open a rock by Moses striking it, and then water gushing out into the open desert floor, they drink, they have their fill, but then Amalek attacks. So that's what's going on. But in both cases, Yahweh provides, whether it's the cracking open of the rock or it's through his supernatural deliverance of Israel, because clearly that's what happens in the battle, right? We recall that Moses is there, lifted up on an elevated position over the people, over the battle, and as he holds the staff of God up in the air, Israel prevails. Joshua leads them to victory, but the moment his arms become weak and tired and can't hold the staff up anymore, the Amalek begins to prevail. So Aaron and Hur intervene and they hold up Moses' arms, and the battle reaches its climactic end with Israel obviously the victors. So keeping that sequence in mind, let's now cross over to Numbers chapter 20 and appreciate what's going on, because of course this sets us up for what happens in Numbers 21. So Israel is on the brink of entering Canaan. Most of that generation who in Numbers 14 rejected the Exodus have now died, and their children have grown into adulthood and have replaced them as the fighting soldiers of Israel's ranks. Israel needs water, and they get attacked. So no, this is important. Again, Moses is stylizing the book of Numbers for us. That, I think, is virtually indisputable, because from Numbers 14 to 21, clearly we only have 7 chapters worth of narrative material here. That in no way, shape, or form even remotely attempts to try to cover everything that happened in that 40-year period. In fact, some of us might even exercise a little frustration when we read through what goes on between Numbers 14 and 21 and ask ourselves that question: what happened during that 40-year period? We get a hint of where they were at various times, but we don't really know very much at all about what they were doing there. Who were the people that they interacted with? Were there moments where God intervened in some other sort of way by doing something supernatural? We just have absolutely no clue until now we get to the end of this. Most of these people have died, and the final figures of Aaron and then Moses have to die before this generation can enter into Canaan. So anyway, Numbers chapter 20, the Lord spoke to Moses: take the staff and assemble the community. You and your brother Aaron are to speak to the rock while they watch, and it will yield its water. So we're actually skipping over that lesson. I should say that part of the text where Moses sins by allowing his pride to get the better of it, and then by disobeying the Lord and striking the rock rather than speaking to it, and certainly speaking the words, must we bring water out for you, dishonoring the Lord in front of all the people. It costs him his entrance into Canaan. But circumstantially, that's what happened before the particular moments of Numbers 21. Speak to it, and they will watch, and it will yield its water. And then, as soon as we get into Numbers chapter 21, when the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming on the Athiram road, he fought against Israel and even captured some prisoners. Then they go and entreat the Lord in prayer and ask, should we fight against them? And if we do, will you deliver them into our hands? If so, we will kill them all. And the Lord delivers them over into Israel's hands, and they indeed fight to victory. So it's a very similar account to what we just read a second ago about Israel needing water earlier in the wilderness with that previous generation that exited out of Egypt and then Amalek fought. So why is the account here being stylized as it is? Now, granted, we've been a lot of space between Exodus chapter 17 and Numbers chapter 20. But again, think of where we are. Exodus 17, we have literally just started the Egypt phase of the Exodus, because they technically weren't out of Egypt until they crossed through the Red Sea. Historically speaking, Egypt controlled all of that land space that we now call the Sinai Peninsula before Israel crossed through the Red Sea. But once they crossed through the Red Sea, now they are in the land of Midian, or the ancient territory known as Arabia. They are officially out of Egypt. And then, of course, we have the very opulent side of Israel walking through the water and it being a conduit of life to them, because they are going to find refuge on the other end, whereas Egypt, sadly, will find nothing but death and tragedy in the wake of that water, as the Lord closes the water in on top of them and they all wind up dying, right? So with those dead bodies of Egyptians washing up at their feet at the beginning of Exodus chapter 15, it's very clear now the Egypt phase of the Exodus is behind them. They're out of Egypt completely, and they have nothing to fear from this decimated people, right? And now we, in Numbers chapter 20, 21, are at the end of the Exodus, because these people have migrated now to the eastern edge of the Jordan River, around the area of Moab, because right after where we are right now, we're going to see Balak, the king of Moab, and Balaam in the picture, and Balak, of course, is hiring Balaam for the skills that he has, and perhaps being able to twist Yahweh's arm and killing his own people, because clearly Balak has no means of doing so on his own. Anyway, to this blue block. In both cases, Yahweh provides. He provides water yet again, in spite of what Moses does in smacking the rock. And then, of course, as they pray to him, we don't even have record of Israel praying to the Lord and asking, should they go against Amalek? But rather, they had the choice, perhaps, with this Canaanite king of Arad who comes out against them. They ask the Lord what they should do, and the Lord tells them, and of course, he's the one, as he did with Amalek, that delivers them over into the hands of the Israelites. So lastly, we have Israel on the brink of entering Canaan, and Moses wants to stop the plague from killing the people. So this is where we are. The people have grumbled yet again, and the Lord now has sent fiery serpents seraphs, as it actually says in the Hebrew text, out to bite the people, and thousands are dying from this plague, from the venomous bite of the snakes. So then the Lord tells Moses, make a snake image and mount it on a pole. When anyone who is bitten looks at it, he will recover. So Moses made a bronze snake, mounted it on a pole. Whenever someone was bitten and he looked at the bronze snake, he recovered. Now, there's a resource that I've given at the end of this PowerPoint presentation that I've used in previous ones. And that is from a man by the name of John Sailhamer, who entitles his book, The Pentateuch as Narrative. So in that particular section regarding Numbers 21 and the bronze snake incident, John makes it a point to isolate the Hebrew text and make it very clear that while the English translators have made what we think is a rather definitive choice on Moses' part to do exactly what the Lord told him. In other words, the way the text, as I just read it to you, frames this up, that the Lord told Moses to make a bronze snake and to mount it on a pole. The Hebrew text actually states that the Lord told Moses to make an image of a fire. And you're thinking, what fire? Well, again, when we read what's going on in the English version of the text, it sounds rather simple. Snakes are jumping up. When I say jumping, I just simply mean that they're appearing. They're coming out from underneath the sand, and that they are finding unsuspecting people and biting them. And the people can't get away from them because they are popping up all over the place. But remember, I just said a second ago, these are fiery snakes or fiery seraphs. So we're not exactly sure, even thousands of years later, what the wordplay is supposed to mean here with respect to what is burning. Is it the appearance of snakes that have shiny skin that reflects the sunlight that appears to be burning? Is it the burning nature of the envenomation of the toxin that comes from their bite as it enters the people's skin and now it's burning at the site where they were bitten, or the nature of the plague, or what? But what the Hebrew text does seem to suggest is that the Lord told Moses to make an image of fire and to mount it on a pole. But Moses then decided to take bronze, perhaps because bronze and snake in Hebrew are very close to one another, etymologically speaking. And by virtue of that, the Lord acquiesced to what Moses did and allowed Moses to do this very thing. And the Lord still made it work either way. Now, I'm sure what I'm saying here may very well be new to you, and that's okay. I'm not telling you should tell your students that per se, but perhaps it might be an interesting point of fact to share with them of how the Lord was gracious even then, that when Moses, for whatever reason, decided to make an image of the snake mounted on the pole, and he chose to do this with the material of bronze, because even with the English text that I read to you, go back to that orange block, make a snake image and mount it on a pole, he doesn't tell Moses to use bronze to do it with. I mean, you might say, well, what else could he have done? Because this perhaps was the most expedient thing. Well, you have to recall the fact that even though bronze as an alloy is made of rather cheap base metals, nonetheless, that stuff has to be smelted. It has to be melted down, and then, of course, after it's molten and liquid, normally you have to pour it into some sort of mold to make it into a rigid shape after it winds up cooling, right? And so to do that, it's going to take time. Certainly, there may have been other more rudimentary materials that Moses could have twisted together, tied together, and fashioned into the image of a snake to mount it on a pole, and then to run through the people and to get them to look as quickly as they could so that no more would die. We really don't know how fast the people are dying or what. But the point being is that Moses seems to take some liberty here. So with that, go to the final blue block. The end result is that the people see the sign and they believe that Yahweh will save them, which is clearly what's happening here. So this is huge for us to make sure that we're bringing out to our students. And you may be asking, okay, well, what's the significance of this, though? Because, yeah, it definitely seems like the account has been stylized to the point where this information in Exodus chapters 4 and 17 definitely seem to create the left side bookend and then information from Numbers 20 and 21 create the right side bookend of people having a need, and that is they want to see something, or they maybe not necessarily want to see something, but need to see something. In Exodus 4, perhaps it's a need, and then certainly in Exodus or Numbers 21, they have no idea what they need. They're dying, but they need to live, or else everyone is going to be consumed by these fiery serpents, biting them. And then Moses creates the sign that the Lord instructed him to in some way, and shares that with the people in the book that they live. Either way, the people have to exercise the sign of faith. So if there's one thing that I would use as a point of connection between all of this, is that it's a sign of faith. Faith is not, I should say, miracles is not what produces faith, but faith is what produces miracles, right? So clearly in Exodus chapter 3, the Lord tells Moses that he has heard the cry of his people. Presumably they have been crying out to Yahweh, and maybe even invoking the promise that he had given to their great ancestor Abraham, that there was a land for them, an inheritance that he promised. Where is that? And they believe that they clearly will never be able to deliver themselves out of their own bondage, but they must lean upon Yahweh. They are powerless to free themselves. He will free them. And certainly they are in the same situation here in Numbers 21. But maybe they're crying out to Yahweh. Maybe they're attempting to try to repent for the grumbling that they had just succumbed to once again. Either way, God is being compassionate here and meeting their need. And then in between these moments, we have them perhaps more pressing need, physically speaking, with respect to the fact that they've run out of water and they will die soon if they don't get it. The Lord provides that. And then, unsuspectingly, Amalek, or the Canaanite king of Arad, comes out and in an unprovoked fashion attacks them, and they're not certain what to do. With Amalek, they seemingly have no choice because there's nowhere for them to go and hide to take refuge in, except to go back to Egypt, which is out of the question. So they have to fight. And then with the Canaanite king of Arad, he has crossed out of his country to come and engage them out in the open field, and then goes back to his country. He's taken prisoners with him. They can choose to just leave him alone and not do anything, or they can go and engage a battle, and they choose to after they've invoked the Lord, and he has told them what he wants them to do. So in both cases, the Lord provides. But they have faith, right? They have faith that as long as the Lord is on their side, both with Amalek and the king of Arad, they will win. So faith is what produces the victory. And then again, with the biting serpents, they look and they live. So how does this all connect to what Jesus is saying to Nicodemus? And I would say that transition is it right there, that it's the sign of faith. This is exactly what Jesus is entreating Nicodemus over as he's speaking to him, because Nicodemus is wanting to talk about the kingdom of God. And then Jesus immediately jumps into, except one be born again, he cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. Then he quantifies further by saying, unless one is born from above by water and the Spirit. Clearly, I would think that's the Spirit of God, as John seems to reference that with the numerous uses of the Spirit throughout the gospel itself, that they cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. And then he uses this example, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, and then everyone looked and lived, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that he will draw all people to himself, and they will not perish, because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes, trusts, fully gives themselves to him in faith, they will not perish but have everlasting life. So that sign of faith is exactly what we're driving toward here. That's what Nicodemus is learning from Jesus. That faith is what is going to be required in order for one to find eternal life and their place within the kingdom. Faith is what's always kept Israel together as far as the remnant is concerned, because faith has prompted action, as it did with Abraham, who was still Abram, living in Mesopotamia, and was approached by the Lord, who told him to leave behind the land of his ancestors and go to a land that he will show him. And then he will bless everyone who blesses him, curse everyone who curses him. but ultimately through Abraham's seed that is yet to be born, he is going to bless all the families of the earth. Abraham has absolutely no clue how this is going to happen. But it's enough for Abraham to act in faith with nothing more to go on other than Yahweh's words. And this becomes the example that Israel must follow. It's the example that is replete throughout the New Testament as well. It becomes the very basis for which Paul is going to be arguing how justification by faith for both Jew and Gentile was going to be the entrance into the kingdom all along. It always has been, even from the days of Abraham. And of course, he begins that argument for us in Romans 4, but maybe even wrote that in an earlier letter to the churches in Galatia. He speaks to them about how Abraham was justified by faith. It had nothing to do with him being circumcised, but everything to do with him choosing to obey Yahweh, leave behind Mesopotamia, and go to where Yahweh sent him. So Jesus is pointing Nicodemus, a renowned teacher within Israel, who, as part of the greater Sanhedrin, has spent his years not only dedicated to learning and to teaching, but in a respectful way is even referred to by Jesus as the teacher of Israel. So clearly he has a position of influence, but not just in a political way as a member of the Sanhedrin, or even in a judicious way as a member of the Sanhedrin, but clearly as a rabbi teaching the people as he travels throughout the various Israelite settlements in what was once their former homeland, where they had complete autonomy as a self-sufficient nation. Right. So with that in mind, as he's telling Nicodemus this, Nicodemus is now has a lot of information to deal with, a lot of questions that he wants to have answered, no doubt. And he has a very vivid picture in his mind of something that happened in the past for their people at an ancient time. And now he understands what it is that Jesus is saying is going to be required for them to enter into the kingdom. Not their credentials, as goes just being circumcised and an Israelite, but they must have faith. And when the sign comes, they better be ready. And I would imagine Nicodemus probably even then didn't understand exactly what Jesus meant, what Jesus was conveying. He was going to be crucified. Certainly, by the end of Jesus' mission, he understood that, as no doubt he was close in proximity to see it after Joseph of Arimathea demanded and was given the body of Jesus by Pilate, because Nicodemus was quick in tow with several pounds of myrrhs and aloes to be able to assist Joseph in being able to anoint the body of Jesus and then place him in Joseph's tomb to inter him before the arrival of Shabbat. So I hope that's helpful in some way in getting you to understand this lesson and material from perhaps a different angle, rather than just reading the material and talking quickly through what happened, as goes. Snakes are biting, people are dying. Moses forms a snake, puts it on a pole, and then people are told to look, and if they do, they will live, and they live. And then we jump straight into John chapter 3 in the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus, and then try to create a direct tangential connection between some pictures that some of us have probably seen of Moses or someone walking around with this pole held high in the air that's probably got a crossbeam on it, as I mentioned earlier in this lesson together, and then try to draw the direct parallel between that and what's going on with Jesus and how both of them were lifted up. I mean, there are several different points of connection here that we could spin off into, and I'm not saying they're wrong. Please don't take that as what I'm saying. But I'm just saying we should spend some time here to develop the text as goes, how this serves as the right side bookend to the story as it began way back in Exodus chapter 4. And if we do that, I think we can help our students see this in a better light. And then we can further develop this concept of this being a sign of faith. And the snake appears in both of those instances where the Lord sends Moses with the sign of the staff becoming the snake. And then now Moses takes Yahweh's words and for whatever reason chooses to mold a snake out of bronze, put it on a pole, but Yahweh still takes what Moses does as an act of faith and makes it work amongst the people so that it now becomes a source of deliverance for them, right? And certainly there is another conversation, or a deeper conversation to be had about where the next place this bronze snake appears in the days of Hezekiah, and he has to smash this thing into pieces because the people have actually idolized it. and chosen to worship it, much like they did Gideon's golden ephod after he was dead. And it becomes a snare to the people, sadly. And of course, there's a connection there with how people can take religion in and of itself and create something of an idol out of it. But that's a conversation for a different time. So I appreciate your time. Thank you for listening, and I hope this was in some way beneficial.